All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. This is our first half, well, say first two-thirds of our first workshop lecture series on web design for literary theorists. Today's discussion is an introduction to HTML, and I'll be teaching you a specific flavor of HTML called XHTML, and I'll talk about why I made that particular choice in a bit. But what you need to know off the top is that there are several kinds of HTML. They have slightly different requirements. They're all mutually intelligible in the way that, different dialects of Spanish are all mutually intelligible, say. So what we'll be teaching today is, well, what we'll be talking about in the series as a whole is I want to give you the sort of basic skills that you can use and leverage them in order to build a small website for a course or a section. And I'll show you one of my not my current websites, but one that I built in the past. And, this is a great resource for students, right? And it's helpful to you in a number of ways, in part because it gives the students easy access to information. It saves you work and from having to carry around copies of documents all quarter, and it helps to make your teaching practices more visible on the web, which is probably a good thing when you do things like apply for awards or jobs or otherwise try to say, hey, I have an actual set of places where you can go to find these questions. So I will be the first person to say that I am not a great designer. I don't think that matters a lot, but those of you who are better designers will walk out of here with enough knowledge to leverage your better design skills. And so one of the things that I want to do throughout this workshop series is give you a chance to do the work to actually build such a website. This is not difficult. Nor is it necessarily much work, and you can scale up as much as you want. I started off small, and then every quarter I use the previous quarter's website as a template for the new website, so I'm not redoing all the work from scratch. And I want to spend some time talking about practices that minimize the amount of labor that you have to spend in order to do so. And again, part of this is intended just to help make your teaching practices more visible on the web. I also want to give you a sort of a general introduction to HTML because knowing HTML is an incredibly helpful thing in many ways over and over as you move around the web. And even if you're not building your own section or course website, there are places where it will come in handy if you are blogging, for instance. It's sometimes the easiest way to do something in a blog post is just to look directly at the HTML that the blogging editor is creating on your behalf. So today, what we're talking about is the basics of HTML, which is sort of the basic language for all web pages on the internet. Virtually everything you see on the internet is an HTML file. Whether or not that's obvious, it's still the case that a web page is a textual document, which is all an HTML document is, that contains at least some text and contains information about how it should be presented. HTML makes a number of assumptions about what text is and how text works that don't always dovetail nicely with our thoughts as literary theorists. But the simple fact of the matter is that most of the time, if all you're trying to do is this, that doesn't matter. I'll be kind of gesturing towards places where HTML makes simplified assumptions about text, but we won't be talking about it in detail today. However, I'd be perfectly happy to have long conversations about this topic because I think it's interesting. It's just not going to be our main focus today. What you should know is that an HTML document is a document that sits on a computer on the web somewhere, and when you type in an address, a URL of a website, what happens is that your computer speaks to the other computer, retrieves that document, and looks at it, and then renders it. That is to say, it interprets it and produces something like this. When you look at this, you're not looking at the actual HTML code, although you can do so in virtually any web browser. And I have too many extensions installed. But realistically, a website, the actual code for a web page might look something like this. This is not easily human parsable, but neither is it incredibly difficult to read. Is it too bright in here for you to see the screen?
No.
What you'll notice in here is that primarily what you've got in here is just text. There's a number of tags in there and other pieces of semantic information that give the browser more information about what the structure of the document is, but basically all you've got in here is text. So, so what I want to do, what I want to spend some time doing today is talk about how you create such documents. And in our follow-up workshop, which we'll schedule for sometime next week, hopefully you'll have done some work towards producing something that looks more or less like that. And we'll talk about how to put those documents on the web. So, anybody have any questions so far? If you do have questions, I want to handle this informally. So please feel free to just jump in. Hi, I don't know you.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. Introduce yourself. I don't know you.
Thank you. I am Elizabeth. I am an international student in the education department.
Okay, welcome.
In the emphasis of writing a study, so that's why I received the invitation.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
And so what I want to have you do ultimately is take the initial steps towards creating some HTML documents that will be the kind of kernel of a section website for your students. So, I'm going to be moving over a lot of details quickly today. I don't want you to feel compelled to take notes on everything. And one thing that I will tell you up front is that I'm going to put a screencast of this presentation with audio on the web in the next couple of days sometime, as soon as I can get some time to process it and upload it. And there will also be this slideshow and any other number of supporting documents. There's already a small website built around this. If you want to write down one URL, here it is. That's where you'll be able to find everything from. And there's also a set of links of useful HTML language references and other useful kinds of tools. If you start doing this and you run into problems, you are absolutely welcome to come talk to me during my lead TA office hours. That's an absolutely appropriate use of my time for that purpose. My lead TA office hours, as some of you know, are 3:30 to 4:30 every Tuesday outside of or in Nicoletti's, depending on where seating's available. If it's available inside, I stay inside. If it's not, I'll sit nearby in a visible location. So if you run...
Tuesday and Thursday?
Just Tuesday, from 3:30 to 4:30. Although I think I'm probably going to have to cancel them this coming week, unfortunately. But please come talk to me if you have any questions. Please come talk to me if you run into any difficulty. There are no dumb questions as far as this goes, and I do realize that most people are starting more or less from scratch here. So you don't have to be embarrassed about asking things that you, based on worrying that I'm going to think that they're obvious. So again, why would you have a course or section website in the first place? Partly because it gives students a central place to look for information, right? Handouts, the section syllabus, right? Every quarter I put that on there, and when students come to me and say, I spilled coffee all over my section syllabus, I can say, well, it's on the website, go print yourself another copy. It's also handy to just be able to put up notes and announcements. And most quarters, although not this one, what I do is I put my own discussion notes on the website, which will contain the basic things that we talked about and any major announcements. Again, super convenient because I can tell students, if you miss section, don't email me to ask what you missed, just go look at the section website. And any kind of policy documents. And again, that's incredibly helpful because students can look at them whenever they need to. And for that inevitable one student that you need to say, I told you so to at some point during the quarter, you can point directly towards that one piece of paper or that one document that's on the web and say, I told you so. This is the attendance policy. You were given a printed copy in advance. And you can point right to that part of the document from an email, which is handy. Also, it helps to make your teaching practices visible on the web. And I've gotten a lot of feedback, good feedback about this as I apply for awards and as I talk to people in the past. As I applied for the writing program this year, for instance, they were very impressed by this. And it helps to establish an identity for you on the web, because my assumption is that at some point each and every one of you is going to be looking for an academic job. That may or may not be true, but at some point somebody is going to Google you and try to find information about you. And this is one way to help create a sort of a central place for your identity on the web. And sure.
Scary anecdote. I had a student who actually did that before she came to my office hours. She came up with academia.edu.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Right now she said, I just Googled you.
Yeah.
And you're a genius because it's like, like yeah, whatever. I was like, oh.
One of the things that we'll be talking about, not so much today, although later in the workshop series in winter and primarily spring quarter, is how you can exercise some control over what Google sees as the most important places to look for information about you. And so developing a centralized place where you have information about your teaching practices, there are strategies that you can use to help leverage that so that it becomes one of the more plausible results for Google to cough up early. Of course, you don't have a lot of control over what Google does, but you can exercise some control by providing hints. And there are things that you can do that Google really likes that will help make, say, your personal website pop up more quickly than, say, that Twitter account you had as an undergrad where you said all those horrible things, right? Again, you don't have a lot of control over it, but you do have some, and I'll show you some ways that you can exercise that. And so a question that I've gotten a lot from people when I started my initial plan for teaching this series last year, and afterwards actually, is, well, you know, learning HTML and related technologies like CSS, that sounds hard. Why don't you just teach us how to use WordPress, Drupal, LinkedIn, academia.edu, Tumblr, something like that? And there's a number of reasons for that. And I want to say up front that these are not necessarily bad moves to make, and that after having gone through this workshop series, maybe you will decide to set up a self-hosted WordPress site, or a non-self-hosted WordPress site for that matter. But you should be aware of the upsides and downsides of that. And one of the upsides of doing something like that, of course, is that it is easy, and you don't have to learn HTML, right? Because one of the benefits of WordPress is it moderates that for you, so you don't need to learn the underlying language. But the fact of the matter is HTML is not that hard. And if you were trying to, say, take WordPress, which is a blogging platform, and wrench it out of place into a more non-blogging oriented website, you already have to learn as much stuff as you would if you just learned HTML and CSS. And, you know, there are other downsides as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. But maybe I should be upfront first about the downsides of building a website by hand with HTML and CSS. You have to learn HTML. Again, not that hard. All of us think about text in particular ways all the time. And so we're already primed for thinking about text in this particular way. It's a new way to think about text for many of us, but it's not a totally foreign way, and it's something that we can adapt to easily. One of the things that you have to do to build a good website, my criteria for good will become clearer as we go along, but one of the things that you have to do to build a website in the ways that I will be identifying as best practices is to think about your content in a non-word processing based way. That is to say, I'll be encouraging you to think about not indicating what your document should look like, which will be the primary focus of our next workshop, but what is the structure of your text. This is perhaps the harder transition for a lot of people to make, because most of the time when we create textual documents, we're thinking presentationally, right? You're sitting there, you're typing the journal article that you're going to submit to the journal, or the conference paper, or the term paper, and you need to type in the name of book that you're writing about, say, right? What do? You hit Control-I for italics. What I would like to suggest is that when you're creating a web page, instead of thinking this is italic text, what you want to indicate in the document is this is a book title. For various reasons, it'll become clear as we go along. This is the primary cognitive shift that you have to make. And why am I cutting off at the bottom here? I guess maybe I should just read the last bullet point line, which says you have to find someone to host the content, which is not difficult nor necessarily expensive. And so I've been using a web host, nearlyfreespeech.net. They don't pay me to endorse them. I'm just a satisfied customer. Despite the fact that I'm hosting almost 300 individual HTML files, plus a bunch of other supporting documents, and I'm constantly encouraging my students to go look at the section websites, and the fact that people find it on Google, it still only costs me about $1 a year. So it does not have to be an expensive kind of thing to do. So what are your other alternatives that you might want to think about using? Well, GauchoSpace is a real obvious one, right? A lot of people do in fact use GauchoSpace for content distribution in courses. And I'd like to suggest that, you know, GauchoSpace is a fine platform on its own terms, but it has two downsides. One is, I think GauchoSpace has horrible layout, and it's hard to find information on there. And those of you who have taught courses in the past where the professor uses GauchoSpace to do things, you will know that a lot of students are constantly asking you, where do I find X on GauchoSpace? And part of the problem there is that GauchoSpace does not, in my opinion, adequately leverage existing web-based reading practices. It just tries to cram as much information on there as possible. Problem is, people don't read web pages start to end in the way that they read a book or a magazine article. They skim for information, and GauchoSpace doesn't support skimming and trying to find information quickly. Again, it's my personal opinion. And the other problem with GauchoSpace is that it doesn't make your teaching practices publicly visible because everything is stuck behind a paywall, right? All that effort you put into creating a site with GauchoSpace isn't leverageable when you go on the job market because it's not visible to people who aren't enrolled in the course. So why not just use some free blogging service, I suppose, is another option. And in many ways, I think that it's a better option than GauchoSpace. There are still some downsides, and one is that you may decide later on that you want to move away from that free blogging platform, and moving your content from one blogging platform to another is a whole lot of work. That if you have a huge amount of existing content on, say, your WordPress site, your Tumblr site, and you decide not to go with WordPress or Tumblr for any number of reasons later on, you're locked in. It's very difficult to move that around without a huge amount of labor. The other downside that's a little less obvious is that all free blogging services to some extent restrict what you can actually do with the HTML code. That is to say, they clean up and sanitize your HTML code to meet their own criteria for what constitutes good HTML. So with Tumblr, you can't use the Q tag, which indicates quotations. There's a lot of good reasons to use the Q tag because, as I'll be talking about throughout the day, one of the things that you should be doing is thinking not about what your code looks like, but how you indicate the structure of the code. The Q tag essentially says to any software that's parsing the document, this is a quote. That's a meaningful thing to indicate both to a human and a machine in a lot of ways. And so having your service on, say, Tumblr, means that you lose the ability to give machines those kinds of hints, which, again, is not something we'll be talking about extensively today, but it'll become increasingly important winter and spring quarter when we meet again. Blogging services also impose their own sort of expectation about how your whole website is organized, right? You can't split your documents into related groups by putting them in different folders in the same way that you could on your own. So, again, why would you think about building a website this way? Partly because it's not that hard, right? And that you can, in fact, learn HTML, or at least the basics of it, before 5 p.m. today, and then go off and do a little bit of practice. You also gain full control over how your text is presented and how your text is organized and ontologized at a machine parsable and human parsable level. You can also move your content elsewhere with a minimum of work if your provider goes out of service or goes out of business or cancels a service that you use, or decides to make a radical change in what kinds of things they'll allow on their platform. And those of you who keep up with these things may note that Google Web Pages last year made a huge change in what kinds of editing they'll allow on the free web hosting that they provided. Or it may be that they just changed their terms of service on you, and that I think that having that it's meaningful to think about the kinds of political implications of who you're doing business with, even if what you're doing is free or low cost. And, you know, there are any number of examples of companies that have had, say, CEO changes this year where there are real problems with the new CEO. If you have your information on a web server that you control, then you can easily move it elsewhere if you decide you don't want to give that company your business anymore. So as a kind of a final way of wrapping up our introductory material, there's a number of things that you won't learn in these workshops. You're not going to learn everything about every version of HTML. We're talking about XHTML today, in part because it helps to enforce good writing practices, and in part because the rules are consistent and easy to learn. You will walk out of here being able to read other versions of HTML if you want to look at them. And a good practice in general, if you see something happening on a web page that is an attractive thing that you'd like to emulate, is just look at the HTML and or CSS code and see how they do that, right? That right-clicking on the page and choosing View Page Source is a great way to learn how people do web design. You're not going to learn everything about cutting-edge designs from this workshop series. Again, what I'm trying to give you is basic skills and the ability to move on from there in directions that interest you. I'm not going to talk about how to produce websites with active content, which means we're not going to be learning JavaScript or Flash or Java for that matter. Why? Well, because this is a more complex thing that does involve real programming skills, which HTML doesn't. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with learning that. I'm just saying it's outside the scope of these workshops. And it's not necessary to do what I'm talking about doing. So what you'll actually wind up learning in these web workshops is how to write HTML documents with their supporting CSS files in a way that supports your online presence management and how to put them on a server so that these web pages are visible to other people. So some of the information I'm going to get here is partial or moderately simplified, but I'm never being intentionally dishonest. It's just that sometimes I'm skimming over the more complex details in order to give you the simple version that always works. You're not going to walk out of here and get web design contracts, but you will walk out of here knowing enough to provide a useful resource for your students and show that off to the rest of the world. So just a quick refresher, how does the internet work, right? You have a web browser. You type a web address in the page, right? What happens? Well, your web browser parses that address to determine what part of the address indicates the server that holds the document, right? The simple version, and again, here's one of those places where I'm oversimplifying. The simple version is that a server is just a convenient name for another computer on the internet that serves these documents. So there is in fact a server that is patrickbrianmooney.nfshost.com, right? In point of fact, it's virtually always the case these days that that's not a single computer, but you can think about it that way. And then the rest of the document, or the rest of the URL, is a specification of where that, where on the server that document is. So here's the server, and here's the specification of where on the server that document is. The easiest way to think about this, and all that's necessary for this workshop series, is that that's a series of folders on that computer that indicates where on that computer's hard drive it is. There are more complex ways to construct location specifiers, and if you pay attention to what happens in your address bar as you go around the internet, you'll see them. But that's the simple version. So the document, your browser determines which computer that document's on and where it is and sends off a request for it. Then it retrieves that document, parses it to see what it consists of, and renders it into a real web page. It also fetches any other supporting documents, right? Which might be a style sheet, a CSS file that says this is how the page should look. Might be images that appear on that web page. And it's worth saying that if you have images, or for that matter, movies or sounds or Java applets that appear on your web page, they are not part of the HTML file itself. They're other objects that appear somewhere, quite possibly on the same server, and the HTML file refers to them. And so then, when all of that is done, your browser has retrieved the document, it's retrieved any supporting documents, it's gone through and constructed a visual representation of them. So it's actually the browser, and this is worth thinking about in at least a little bit of detail. It's actually the browser itself and not the server that turns this into this. And then hopefully the user does something with your document after all that technical background work has been done. So again, two parts of the URL. The server name itself and where on the document where on the server the document appears. Your website itself will consist of multiple HTML files. Each HTML file is a separate page, and it'll contain any other supporting media that the documents refer to. Questions so far? Again, feel free to jump in. Call me on oversimplifications if you think they matter and you know about them. Okay. So, what is HTML? HTML, as you probably know, and many of you are cognizant of most of this information already. I'm not telling you this because I'm certain that all of you don't know it. I'm telling you this because I want you to have it in mind during the rest of our discussion. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's the standard way of describing the structure of documents on a website. It's not a programming language, and I'll show you some quick examples in just a minute. There are no commands and there are no variables, which are mandatory features of any real programming language. You're not telling the computer to do anything, you're just describing the structure of a textual document. HTML doesn't give you complete control over every tiny aspect of how a document appears in the user's browser. CSS regains you a lot of that control, but what you have to realize is that as we move away from print as a medium, well, let me put it this way. If you were writing a book, your publisher will print it on a specific sheets of paper at a specific size, and everyone's experience of reading the book and interacting physically with the book will be the same. If you write a web page, people are going to look at it at a huge variety of different kinds of devices, right? Laptops, desktops, smartphones, dumb phones, tablets, right? And so not all of these devices have the same kinds of display capabilities. And so part of the one of the things that you need to let go of as a web page designer is the idea that you can design, that you have complete control over how things look on the page. That is to say, some people have much smaller screens than others. Some people are looking at web pages on devices that can't display anything other than plain text. Think about library terminals from the late 80s, if that's a meaningful point of reference, where all you had was 80-column screens with plain text, no italics, no bolding, no graphics, just text, 80 columns wide. People are still looking at the internet that way in one version or another. So you don't have complete control over exactly how your page looks, although you can have a great deal of control over how it will appear to most people. But part of what you'll be doing as a web page designer is dealing with a document markup language that is designed to allow your documents display to fail gracefully on a variety of situations. And HTML is a standard that's designed and administered by the World Wide Web Consortium. Again, there are multiple versions. For those of you who don't know, HTML5, which people have been using for years and has been under development since about 2005, finally became a formally recognized standard a few weeks ago. So this is exciting. Am I going to be teaching you HTML5? Actually, no, it's much more complex. But you can move into HTML5 understanding these basic ideas. So, some coding examples. And if you're following along on your work, laptop, what I'd like you to do is just have a document that is a plain text document somewhere in a folder on your desktop. Open up your plain text editor. I use and recommend one called Bluefish, which is available for every major operating system. But if you don't have Bluefish installed, open up Windows Notepad or something else that can save plain text files. Something that would be created as a .txt file, and save it in your desktop folder wherever you're working. Just give it the name index.html for reasons I'll talk about later. What you have here is a blank document, right? And so I'm just going to type in a short sentence. Because somebody has to say that at some point. Of all the books I've read in grad school, the single biggest waste of time was Infinite Jest. And so what I have now is a file, index.html, that's in my folder, and what I'm going to do is just display it in my browser. I'll say up front that this is not a valid HTML file, but it's already close enough that your browser can interpret it, right? All I have is plain text. If you have any trouble following along, please let me know. And so here's the major concept of HTML. You have plain text, and what you're doing is you're marking up your text with so-called tags that indicate various things about the structure of it. So I'm going to give you a bad example, and I'll talk about why it's a bad example in just a minute. What do you think that I tag means? Yeah, italics. And again, the part where the italics end is the /I. All tags start with a less than sign and end with a greater than sign, right? That's what a tag is. So if I then save that and reload it in my browser, you'll notice that I then have some text in italics. That's all HTML really is. You have a plain text file that has its structure marked up. The problem with using the I tag, and I specifically started off with this example because I want you to think again about something I've already said, is that the I tag doesn't say anything about why the text is in italics, right? And if you'll notice, those two examples of italic text up there already mean two different things. The word all is in italics because it's something equivalent to vocal emphasis. If I were reading it aloud, I would say, of all the books, right? However, infinite jest is in italics because it's the title of a book, right? I would not probably emphasize that the same way as the word all if I were reading this aloud. So why is this a problem? What about visually impaired users and their screen readers that they're using, right? That screen readers, in order to help screen readers out, and screen readers are a great metaphor for all kinds of automatic processing that happens of web documents. In order to help screen readers out, it would be helpful to indicate whether I'm marking up vocal emphasis or whether I'm marking up something like a title, right? There are many reasons in English why we might put things in italics. So this is a better practice. And again, this is the short version of one of the things that I want you to be able to understand in this seminar. EM doesn't mean italics. It happens to be rendered in italics by default in browsers, but what it actually means is emphasized text. Whereas I'm going to mark up the citation with a tag that says cite. So far, so good? Okay. Now if I save that and reload it, you'll notice that the display is the same, but I've already gone a long way towards indicating that there are two separate things going on with the formatting here. Again, if you have any questions, please jump in and let me know. This is still not a valid HTML file because I'm not doing quite enough to meet the minimum standards for what I have to do in order to indicate the structure of the document. And so I'm going to wrap that paragraph with the P tag. What does the P tag mean? This is the beginning and end of a paragraph, right? Technically, you should always wrap your paragraphs, if they are in fact paragraphs, with P tags. Does that change the display of the document? No. However, it does give the browser and any other machine that's parsing this document some information. If I then have a second tag, or a second paragraph, just in case anyone is tempted to think that I just don't like postmodern fiction. You'll notice that I then have a second paragraph in my document. Any questions at all? Okay. So all I'm really doing here is indicating the structure of the document to the web browser. This is still not quite even a minimally acceptable HTML document, because an HTML document has to have a few other features. In particular, everything has to be wrapped in a tag that says, this is some HTML text, right? That should be not quite the very first thing that you do if you're being compliant, but it should be one of the first things. Finally, the HTML tag is itself a container, right? As a matter of fact, all of the tags that I've indicated here are so-called containers. Not all tags are containers, but what does a container mean? It means this tag is designed to contain some text. So the HTML tag contains everything else. The P tags contain entire paragraphs. The EM tag contains text that should be emphasized. The cite tag contains a title, right? Pretty straightforward. There are tags that don't contain other things, and we'll talk about the image tag in a minute. But the HTML tag has to contain at least two other things. One is every document has to have a heading. and the heading itself has to contain a title. So far, so good? Okay. Finally, the stuff that's not in the heading, we're not going to talk about other stuff that you can put in the heading in there, but the short version is that's where you put your metadata. We'll talk about that in our third workshop. But the stuff that's not part of the heading is part of the document's body. And so you'll notice that when now that I've saved and refreshed this document, the title that I put in there becomes part of the title bar. Good practice, the title in your title bar should be the actual title of your document. You will notice as you go around the web that this is often not the case, right? Ideally, this should be the title of your document, not the title of the entire website. And I think that the place where we notice this the most often is when students get it wrong in citations. They just grab whatever the title is in the title bar and treat it as the title of the citation. So help to make things non-confusing for students and other people who think like them. Make the thing in the title bar the actual title of your document. Some other tags that you should use. You will notice that one of the things that doesn't appear in this document is there is no title at the top, right? There's a series of heading tags that you should use to indicate headings of documents. You'll notice that I've already broken my own rule by giving my document a title that doesn't match the title in the title bar. I'm doing that specifically so that I can point out that what appears in the title bar is what appears in the title tag, which goes in the heading section. There's an H1 tag, which of course means the top level heading. There's also a series of tags for other subheadings if you want to use them. And these tags are H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. I think that's enough heading levels for virtually everybody. I myself have never used 6 levels of headings. And if you do, then I guess you'll have to work around that somehow on your own. But I'm not aware that it's ever been a real problem for any substantial group of people. Questions so far? This is almost a minimally valid HTML document. And in fact, it gives us enough to go back to the slideshow and go through some more material here. So again, major concepts. HTML consists of plain text marked up with tags that indicate the structure of the text that's being marked up. I will be the first to say that this is a rather ugly document, right? You will probably not want to present a web page to the world that looks like this. We'll talk about that later. What I really want you to, and I promise you that it is not all that difficult to get this to be non-ugly. However, for purposes of our workshop series, really, indicating the structure is far more important for now than indicating how it should look. If you write well-structured documents, it's easy to make them look pretty. There are several dozen legitimate tags. Many of them you will never use. You will probably never use H6. You may not ever use the dictionary definition tags, right? If you're not putting a vocabulary list online. Everyone begins with a less than sign and ends with a greater than sign. Some tags can have, oh my God, that's so not displaying right. Some tags can have attributes. And what I'm trying to show you here is a tag that says image src equals kitten.jpg, right? We'll talk about the image tag in just a second. But ideally, and technically, you're mandated to include the width in pixels and the height in pixels of the document in the image tag in order to be formally compliant. And we'll talk about the image tag in a minute. Some rules for putting tags together. Every tag that you open, you have to close. So if you open the emphasis tag, you have to close the emphasis tag. Technically, you're obligated to close the tags in the reverse of the order that you open them in order to be compliant. Personally, this is one of those parts of HTML that I don't like. I don't think that in real life, text is structured this way. However, it is in fact a mandatory thing for your text to be compliant, for your HTML documents to be compliant. So here I have opening tag I, opening tag B. What do you think B does? It's another tag I recommend you not use. B makes text bold, right? So if I want the text to be both bold and italic, I can put it inside the I tag and the B tag, right? Again, If you want your text to be bold and italic, then it's far better to use CSS or to use the semantically meaningful alternatives. Instead of using I'd use EM, and instead of using B, I'd use strong, which means very strongly emphasized text, which happens to display by default in bold in most users' web browsers. So if I open the B tag last, I have to close it first. This is wrong, technically. Most browsers will work around such a trivial problem as this okay, but this is a good habit to get into because the basic rule is if you're doing it right, all web browsers will display it the same. If you do it wrong, web browsers try to guess what you really meant, and some of them are better than others at that. So get into the habit of doing it right. Some tags can be self-closed. And the example, of course, is off the screen, but I'll give you, I think it's, well, okay. What self-closed means, tell you what, I just won't project it all the way onto the screen. So, for a tag to be self-closed, that just means you have a space and then a slash. The image tag doesn't contain other text, right? It just means put an image in here. So it's not a container, and the way that you close it is before you type the closing tag, just have a slash. Questions? Okay. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to remind you that the non-electronic texts that you work with are already marked up in various ways. And those of you who are digital humanists have a great appreciation for this already, because you think about textuality a lot. But I'll just point you towards, say, Jerome McGann, whom I have a fair amount of respect for, although I disagree with them on a number of things. But one of the things that he's pointed out is that everything that you deal with is already marked up in some ways, right? By being printed on pages, by being divided into paragraphs and chapters and sections. That italicization in printed texts is already a form of markup. And so is punctuation, for that matter. It's indicating the grammatical structure of a document. So all you're doing with your HTML markup is making these kinds of things that you already are so familiar with that you spent through grade 8 learning to interpret. You're making them explicit to machines in addition to people. You're making a set of hermeneutic clues explicit. So here's a minimally acceptable HTML document. You'll notice that basically it's just what we typed so far with a couple of additional things. There's a so-called doc type declaration. What this is it's just a declaration to any machine that's parsing which version of HTML you're using. It's a long string of gibberish that's not meant to be intelligible to you. How do you know what to type in there? Well, for me, I just copy and paste it from other documents I've designed. But for you, if you've never used one before, then you should look at one of the lists of doc types that's available on the internet. One of the things I really do like about HTML5, which is the new standard, is its doc type is just doc type, doc type HTML. So the World Wide Web Consortium finally got that right on HTML version 5. However, if you declare that you're using HTML version 5, you'd better actually be using HTML version 5, which is rather complex. So I recommend that you do this, and you can copy and paste that from lists of doc types on the web, one of which is linked from the set of links that accompanies this presentation on the internet. And you'll notice that here I've given the HTML tag an XMLNS attribute. That's just a declaration that if this document is being parsed as an XML document, and this is one of the advantages of teaching XHTML, for those of you who are interested in machine processing, is that every XHTML document can be processed, is also an XML document, and can be processed with tools that process XML documents. So in order to be a valid XML document as well, you have to indicate the namespace for that document, and that's all this is doing. Do you need to, would you ever memorize these things? Almost certainly not. You'll copy and paste them from somewhere just to make your document valid. So again, not something to worry about. I'm just spending way too much time explaining why it looks like this and saying that technically these are requirements. So one tool I would like to introduce you to is the so-called web page validator from the World Wide Web Consortium. And again, what this is it just checks your documents, not to see if they make sense to humans, but just to see if they pass a formal validity test. So you'll notice that this document we've designed together does not quite pass a formal validity test. It gives a bunch of warnings, one of which is you haven't declared what text encoding system you're using, right? By default, most contemporary web browsers and other pieces of parsing software assume you're using 8-byte Unicode. And if your text editor gives you a choice or asks you what version or what kind of text encoding am I using, that is always the right answer, UTF-8, unless you know why it's not the right answer for some other reason. And it's complaining there is no doc type, and it's complaining again there is no doc type. So actually what I'm going to do is just copy and paste that doc type declaration and the XML namespace declaration. And then pass it through the validator again. You should always pass your documents through the validator. I will be the first to say that not all of my documents are technically valid, but I know the ways in which they're not valid, and I'm willing to make those trade-offs for various reasons. So passing this through, it says tentatively pass 2 warnings, and it's telling me again, you haven't declared how the text is actually encoded. That's a comparatively small problem that I'm okay with for now. And that's generated 2 separate warnings.
Close the door?
Yeah. Is it distracting out there?
No, I was just asking if you wanted me to close it.
Oh, well, I'll get it. Questions so far? So tags, by default, are divided into 2 kinds. Block level tags, like P. What do you notice about P? It always creates a new block of text, right? And if you have longer blocks of text, just to provide a visual indication here, you can tell more now that this looks a bit like a block of text. There are a number of block level tags that you might use, right? Block quote. You know what this is for, right? You all know what a block quote is. What the block quote tag does is just indicate that it's a block quote. And by default, web browsers will display this by indenting on the left side. H1, H2, also H3, H4, and H5, which aren't up there, and H6 marks up various levels of headings. P marks up paragraphs. UL and OL create lists. And they always contain LI tags, which are list items. One of the things that I like about using a programming text editor, even though I'm not really a programmer for HTML, is that it does a number of useful things like syntax highlighting. You will notice that if I put my pointer at the beginning or end of a tag, it also highlights the matching other tag. This can be really helpful if you're dealing with a long block of stuff or a complex block of stuff, so that you know where the beginning and end tag is. As a best practice, when I open a tag, I like to close it immediately most of the time, and then work within it. Something else that's worth pointing out is that HTML, by default, collapses white space. White space means spaces, carriage returns, tabs, right? No matter what you do for stuff like this, or that is to say, if you do stuff like this, you will see that despite the fact that I've put a bunch of extra returns in here, all of those are being stripped out when it gets rendered, right? I still just get this single sentence, however, I quite enjoyed House of Leaves. This is something that you can take advantage of in order to help make your code easier to read. If I indent over here, that's not going to give me any, what are other books we've all read lately? Notice that I'm closing off tags in the reverse order that they're opened. So that's what an unordered list looks like by default, bullet points. Again, you can use CSS to control what it actually looks like. There are also some so-called inline tags, which is to say these do not create new block level elements. They just occur within the text. And you've already seen, say, cite, right? Doesn't begin a new paragraph, doesn't indicate a new block of text, just indicates a citation. Similarly, the code tag marks up computer code. By default, most web browsers will display that in a monospaced font, but again, you shouldn't use the code tag to create the effect of a monospaced font. You should use it for actual computer code because it has a semantic meaning and machines try to read it too. The image tag embeds an image. The strong tag marks up text that is very strongly emphasized. The Q tag marks a quotation. One of the great things about the Q tag is that it gives you smart quotes usually on most browsers. But you shouldn't use it just for smart quotes because there are other ways to do that. You should use it to indicate this is a quotation. The image tag, very popular. You might do something like this, where what you're doing is you have to do a number of things. You have to indicate where the image actually is. There are a number of ways to indicate where the image is, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But the simple case is if your image tag is in the same place as your image, that's to say the same folder, then you can just use the file name. Images need to occur inside paragraphs or other block level elements. And it seems that I have not correctly specified the file name. That is correct. Constant annoyance. Little typos can cause real problems. And I think I got the height and the width backwards there.
So what's the consequence if you don't specify the height and the width?
The short version is you're not technically valid. You may or may not care about that. However, there's a real reason why you should specify the height and the width, and that is that if the there now we have an actual properly non-bonsai kitten. There is a good reason to specify the height and the width explicitly, and that is when your user's browser is rendering the document, what it has to do is make a separate request to the server to say, please also send this picture of a kitten, right? What if that takes a long time to send? Well, if you don't specify the height and the width, then rendering stops because the browser doesn't know how big it is and how much space to leave for it. If you specify the height and the width, the browser can keep rendering the web page while the image is coming through. You don't look like you buy that, Lizzie.
No.
Okay. Again, that was more of a problem in like 1997 when everyone was on dial-up. But it is still potentially a problem because, you know, what if you're hosting your images on, say, Imgur, right? Maybe Imgur is down, and so the image never comes through. That's a problem. Basically, the browser will stop rendering until it gives up, and then it'll keep rendering. So you really should always specify the height and the width. Technically, mandatory also is the alt attribute, which is to say, this is the text you should read if you are a screen reader for visually impaired people. Because of course, visually impaired people can't see the picture of the kitten, right? So in my HTML code, I might just write alt equals a kitten. So far, so good? You'll notice that the image tag has so-called attributes, right? Height, width, alt. As a best practice, you should always enclose attributes in quotation marks. XHTML makes that mandatory, not all versions of HTML do. But the rules for when you don't have to do it in other versions of HTML are actually quite complicated. And so the simple version is, if you have an attribute, put quotation marks around, not the whole thing, but just its value. So the number 192, the phrase a kitten. Questions about that?
Do you need to specify the height and width of the page that you're making so that...
As a matter of fact, it's actually quite difficult to specify the height and width of a page in a way that works all the time on all combinations of software for looking at it. And the short version is you can't do it 100% of the time anyway. That is to say, the browser belongs to the user. They're allowed to set how much of the window it is. So remember that if you have a browser, that different people will be looking at your document on different size screens and in different size windows. Not everybody surfs the web with a maximized window. And if you're in the CRC on one of the computers that has a huge monitor, you may not be. But remember that one of the benefits of HTML is that it will in fact reflow your text for you, under different circumstances. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So the height and width attributes are measured in pixels. You can resize your image just by changing the height and the width. And in fact, what I've done is I found a huge image of a kitten and I've cut it down to 1% of its original size, right? 10% horizontally and 10% vertically. Just by typing in different numbers. Realistically speaking, that's a bad idea a lot of the time. Like, why would you do that? Why would you pay extra to host all that data? Because chances are, the more data you have, the more expensive it is. And then it has to be transmitted over the internet, which will also cost you more because you're probably also paying by the megabyte for transmission, right? Also, it takes longer if you're transmitting over the internet to have a huge image sent than a small one. So if you're going to display it small, store it small as a general rule. The fewer images you use, the more quickly your web page will render because, again, each image requires a separate connection to the server, a separate download, and each one is a potential bottleneck. You can ameliorate this delay with the height and the width attributes. Using a bunch of spurious damn images just because you can use a bunch of spurious damn images makes you look like a 12-year-old, right? Include what you need to include on your website. I'm a big fan of minimalist website design to a large extent, and that seems to be a general trend that web designers are moving in. We'll talk about design more next time. But it's also quite popular for modernist web designers, or web designers who are academic modernists, that minimalism is a real, has a lot of cachet right now. You should use the alt attribute for the 98% of times where you're using an image for the image itself. Technically, it's always mandatory, which I think is kind of annoying. It should be suggested, because there are images that you're using that are purely decorative occasionally, right? However, in that case, just use a space with quotes around it as the alt attribute if you're worried about compliance, or if you're not, just drop it, because that'll work okay in real life anyway. Image file sizes can be much, much larger than the HTML documents that refer to them. And so it's quite possibly the case that if you're storing your own HTML documents on a server where you're paying for storage and bandwidth, then that may be the major driver for what it costs you. This is the other side of that coin is, if you're trying to save money, hosting your images somewhere other than on your own server is a smart move. because then if you host them on, say, Flickr or PhotoBucket or Imgur or one of the dozens of other options that you have, chances are that you'll save a lot of money, right? The problem, of course, is then you then have to worry about, are those services going to go down? Are you complying with their terms of service, right? So, for instance, Flickr doesn't, if you want to have pictures of naked people on your website, Flickr is not ideal, right? You have to comply with Flickr's terms of service. But, you know, it may also be the case that it's not just pornography, because terms of service often have very specific objections to very specific things. So if you are a scholar of something violent, you may not be able to host pictures of that on Flickr, right? I'm not saying that we should all go out and post pictures of beheadings on our web pages, but I am saying that there's a real possibility that this is something that you will be studying, right? Maybe not you particularly, but that there are many, many circumstances of this type that fall more or less under that category. Elizabeth?
What's the proprietary relationship between like a website like Flickr? Do they own your photos? If you put them up? Because I know Facebook would.
Right. Varies depending on the service that you're using, right? With Flickr, no. And that's one of the reasons why I tend to host stuff on Flickr a lot of the time. But technically, a lot of the time, I'm breaking Flickr's terms of service by violating the rule that says any image that you host on Flickr has to be surrounded by a tag that links back to the image on Flickr, right? Most of the time, I comply with that. Once in a while, I have in the past bent the rules. If you're wondering what format you should use to store your images in, the rule of thumb is, unless you know why you're doing it differently, photographs and things that are very much like photographs visually should be stored as JPEGs. If it's more like a line drawing, you should store it as PNG. Don't store it as Windows bitmap, that's huge, right? Don't store it as TIFF, that's not supported by most browsers. And probably also it's huge. So there are reasons to do specific other things. If you want animations, GIF is the better choice most of the time, because PNG doesn't support that. Although PNG will generally, in comparison to GIF, give you the option of having more colors and will compress better. So if you don't want to look into why to do what, photographs or JPEGs, everything else is PNG. What makes hypertext? Links, right? So what does the A tag do? Primarily, it creates links. So if I want to have a link on this page, I have to add that. I have in the paragraph, I might say something like a href equals a URL. Questions so far? Okay. All I'm doing with that tag is creating a link to my personal web page. Simple enough. But links are, in fact, what makes the internet the internet. That's what makes the internet a web, right? So, what do you need to know about links? You can use them for several different things. The primary reason that you'll actually use links is to create, that you'll use the A tag is to create links, right? Here's a link to GauchoSpace. Pretty straightforward. I might reasonably construct that on a course website that I'm constructing. You can also use the A tag with, instead of using the href attribute, you can use the name attribute to say, this is a point in this document that I want to be able to link to. So I might very well say, here's a point in the document that I'm going to name No Very Late Papers. Where would I include something like that? Perhaps in my section of guidelines handout, right? And so, then I have some other HTML below it, right? What would I use this for? I put this in my section guidelines handout so that one time that seems to happen like a law of physics every year where someone drops off the face of the earth and doesn't turn in their week 5 paper and then sends it to me by email during week 9, I can link back directly to the No Very Late Papers point in my email itself, right? Here's the policy that says you were supposed to turn this in absolutely no more than 3 weeks ago. However, there are other ways to create anchor points within the document, and one is just to use the ID attribute, which you can put on any tag. We'll talk a little bit more about the ID attribute in a little bit. This is actually much more sensible and shorter for reasons I'm not going to go into. More sensible for reasons I'm not going to go into, and shorter for reasons that are probably obvious. Regardless of whether you use the name attribute on the A tag or the, what am I trying to say? The ID attribute on some other tag, then you create a link the same way. And this is kind of a cumbersome example because I tend to create long URLs on my personal website. But I might say something like, details are spelled out in my, here is the A reference, no, in my late paper policy. What is this? Here's the full URL to a document. I then have the pound sign and the name of the anchor that I created.
So that's going to show up, what's getting highlighted when you actually show that up? I mean, you know, when you show the link.
What's going to get highlighted? Oh, why did we go back to the beginning? What's going to get highlighted is whatever is inside the A tag. Let's just copy and paste that and I'll show you.
So would it be late paper policy?
Yeah, the words late paper policy will be highlighted. Is my presentation soft? Oh no, it's not frozen. Okay. So here's what it would look like. Okay. All right, moving along. This is by far the most complicated thing I'm going to tell you today. And that is, whenever you have to specify a URL as part of an HTML document, there are several different ways to specify that URL. Probably the easiest way to point it out is that you can always give a so-called fully qualified URL. That is to say, you can always start with http:// and give the full link to the document, right? This also works if you're giving the source for an image. You can always do that. It's considered very rude to link to someone else's image online that they're hosting and embedded in your own web page without permission, although it's less of a problem and it's less of an offense than it was 15 years ago. Because if you do that, well, two things. One is, you're stealing, they're then paying for the storage and bandwidth for an image that you're using, right? Because storage and bandwidth costs have gone down a lot, that's less of a problem than it used to be. However, the other side of the coin is, if you're doing that, you're making the assumption that they're not going to change what's at that location, which can be bad for you.
Are you going to tell the story about the guy who...
I had a friend as an undergrad who was trying to sell himself for an intern, sell himself as a technically savvy guy for an internship. And so he put his resume online and he found a background image he liked, and the night before they looked at his resume, whoever was hosting the image noticed that someone else was using it and replaced it with, let's just say it wasn't something that he wanted a potential employer to see. So he didn't get the job. You know, in part because there was a picture of a naked midget with a leather vest on a tricycle as a background image for his resume, but in part, right, exactly. I mean, that was apparently the idea. And I don't know if they were angry about it or if they just, right. I don't know if they were angry about it or if they just noticed that here was an opportunity to, you know.
Could have been the best intern ever.
Yeah, could have been. Yeah. Right, interesting tiled background image, right? So, yeah. So it's a bad idea to hot link to someone else's image without asking permission first. So yeah, you can always specify the full path to anything anytime you have to specify a URL, but this gets cumbersome. And also it makes it hard for you to create a set of documents that you can move around together, right? Maybe you want to reorganize the folder structure on your website. And then you would, if that were the case, if you'd done that and then you'd done everything, if you referred to all your own documents in the fully qualified URL kind of way, man, you'd have to change all those URLs if you moved a folder around, right? Because the location on the server would also change. So there are other things that you can do. You can specify URLs partially. And often, if we take this as the location of the document that you're referring to, if the HTML document containing the references is at, say, this location, then if you don't have any HTTP or folders or anything else, you just have a file name, what that means is another document in the same folder. So far, so good? Okay. Let me give you an example, because here's the file structure for my website, right? Everything starts with the top level folder is named ~Patrick. Should you name your top level folder that? Should you name your top level folder, say ~Ashley or ~Cheryl? I have specific reasons for doing that. You may just want to put everything, you may not want to have a top level folder name that's anything. You may want to have all your stuff one level up. I have my specific reasons for doing that. I just want to point out I'm not necessarily recommending that as a practice. So if this is your top level folder, and your document is, let's see, TA index. So if this is the document referring to other folders, right here, index.html, then if I just use a file name bulletpoint.png, that means another file in this same folder. So far, so good? Okay. It can get more complicated. I can refer to another document that's in a subfolder of the current folder, right? So if I have a subfolder s14/English133so/index.html, then I'm referring to this document, right? 2 levels down. Notice that this specifier doesn't start with a slash. It just has a name of a folder that's in the current folder. I can also refer to a folder above the current folder, right? So again, if this is the document doing the referring, in which the link occurs, then if I have ../personal.html, always means the folder above this folder. So here's ..personal.html, up 1 level. So far, so good? Okay. You can always start at the top level folder if that makes life easier for you. You don't ever have to use the ... convention to refer to a higher level document. So I can always refer to a document, that same document I was just talking about, as being in ~Patrick/personal.html, and that refers to this same document, right? If you know your way around the command line, you already understand the ... syntax, because it's based on Unix file systems, file system conventions.
And this ~Patrick is referring to a folder on your...
On my server.
Oh, okay.
Because what I'm looking at here is just my local copy of the folder that's on my server.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was going to say it on your personal laptop, but no.
I just keep the 2 in sync. And that's one thing that I like about Linux, is that you can name folders anything you want. So I can, in fact, keep it in sync in exactly that way. It'd be very difficult to do that under Windows. The fact that you have multiple options for how you refer to the location of a specific file is a good argument for having a sensible folder layout that you've thought out in advance for the folders and files on your website. So one thing that I'll recommend is that as you develop a website, think about how you're going to organize your files, because how these folders work is going to be reflected in the URLs where your documents are. Does that make sense? So don't just throw everything all together at the top level folder. Create subfolders to help organize things topically. That was the most complicated thing we're going to talk about. If it seemed difficult or some of it went over your head, don't worry about that. Just recognize that you are, in fact, going to see other people doing this kind of thing in documents. Some other HTML tags we haven't talked about yet. You can create tables. What is that? Little spreadsheets that you embed in your documents. I will go ahead and say offhand that this example is an awful example and that I would never ever do this on a public website. A publicly accessible web page reveals students' grades, right, on say a person. But just to give you an example of what you might do conceptually with a table starts with a table tag, ends with a closed table tag, and in between has table rows, TR, and perhaps a table header, which is a good idea. So just to show you what this looks like. We'll put it at the bottom of our sample document. What have I done? It's not lining up. Let me see what the validator has to say about this. It is often the case. What's that?
It sounds so kind of scary, the validator.
The validator. Let's see what the validator.
I feel like we need to have a person in our department called the validator that we can go to.
This is what happens when I design my slideshows late at night. You're the validator. There we go. My bad, and I will change that on the slideshow. Actually, I'll change it on the slideshow right now. TH is not a substitute for the row. It's a substitute for the data cell. Do you know, I think I did that with last year's presentation too. Okay, so here we are. What is this? Again, you just have a simple table, 2 rows, 2 columns. If I want to draw lines in between them, I can do that with CSS. If I want to change the way the header looks, I can do that with CSS. If I want to change the font that is used to display all this stuff on the page, I can do that with CSS. What I want to do now is just indicate that this is a doable thing and that you can, in fact, create tables in order to display tabular information. Back in the old days of the web, before we had CSS, it was common for people to say, you know what you should do in order to control the layout of your page is you should put everything in one big table, right? So you can have a row of links off to the left or on the top or whatever, and then you have your main content in the rest of the table. Don't do that, just don't. Every so often you may hear someone recommending this as a way of doing page layout, and it's a really bad idea. One reason is tables are interpreted by machines as having a semantic meaning. This is a table, right? This is a display of tabular data. And so there's a number of implications of this, like it really screws with screen readers for visually impaired people, again. And if Google is processing your page, it makes it difficult for Google to understand what the page is actually about. It's also the case that if you do this, nothing on your web page will display until everything has been loaded. So it slows down rendering a lot because you can't indicate how big each table cell is supposed to be easily in your HTML. So why am I telling you this? Just to have you avoid a common piece of bad advice. A decreasingly common piece of bad advice, but still a fairly common one. Some other things that we should talk about. There are characters that you cannot put in an HTML document. Why? Because they have special meanings. You shouldn't use the less than or greater than sign, for instance. Why? Because that means this is a tag. If you need to use the actual less than or greater than sign, you should do this instead. Also, because the ampersand means this is the beginning of a special character, you can't just use an ampersand. You have to use the special so-called character entity and amp. Also, quotation marks, that's what we put around attribute values. I find that this, not being able to directly type a quotation mark into an HTML document and still have a valid document is the single most annoying thing about HTML. And despite the fact that I've been doing this for around 15 years and I, by default, create most of my documents for my students as HTML documents, I still forget that about twice a month. So, quotation marks, the double quote, should be replaced with and QUOT semicolon. So-called entity references always begin with an ampersand and end with a semicolon. You can use the semicolon normally in your documents, that's okay. But ampersand always means this is the beginning of an entity. It may be the case that you want to include characters in your HTML document that you can't type easily on your keyboard, and you can use character references for that too, right? So if you want to use the acute E, or the E with an acute accent over it, and you don't have a French keyboard, well, if you can type that directly into your document, go ahead. And if you know how to do that, or if you want to copy and paste it from somewhere else, say, go ahead. On the other hand, you can just use this. Notice that these two things are different only in case. Case is significant in the names of entity references. And E with a lowercase e, acute, semicolon, gives you a lowercase E with an acute accent. Uppercase, again, the difference is only in case. You may occasionally want to use the pound sign, right? Hard to type on your keyboard unless you bought your computer in Britain. You can use and pound, semicolon. And copy is the copyright sign. There are about 9 bazillion of these, and they're references on the internet. How do you get an uppercase U with an umlaut over it? Again, if your document is encoded as Unicode, it's perfectly okay to just type those in if you can. It's also perfectly okay to use entity references if that's easier. And chances are that whatever foreign languages you work with, you will learn, several of these offhand very quickly, and then once in a blue moon, look up the others. Here's some tags that you will see, but will generally not use, or at least you shouldn't in designing your own website. We've talked about some of them already. Bold text, big and small, for increasing and decreasing text size. The blink tag isn't even supported by most browsers anymore. What do you think that does? Aside from making people hate you. Yeah, it makes flashing text on your page, right? This was a big deal in like 1997 with HTML 2.0, because HTML then was primarily just used for static pages, and there weren't even images on web pages yet as an integrated part of web pages. So this was a way to get something other than static text on your web page. But we don't use it anymore because it makes people hate you. Because blinking text is really, really, really annoying. Right. Again, early way to get some motion of some kind on your web page. Universally despised now. Don't use the center tags for centering text. Use CSS instead. Again, we'll talk about how to do that. Don't use the font tag. Don't use super or sub. Again, use CSS for all of this stuff. Why am I showing you this? Because you will see these tags on other people's web pages if you look at them. And because, quite frankly, if you were editing your post on Tumblr, this may be the way that you need to indicate some of that stuff to Tumblr, because Tumblr doesn't let you easily apply a CSS in the way that you would like to. So being conversant with this so that you can use it in those random other places on the internet where you have some control over HTML is a sort of a useful reference. Don't use it when you're designing your own web page, because part of the reason for designing your own web page is so you don't have to do this anymore. And again, we'll talk next time about why that is. So here's some good semantic XHTML practices. Some of them are mandatory. I'm not going to bother to distinguish which are mandatory and which are just a really good idea. As a rule, your code should follow the semantic rules and be formally valid. If you open a tag, close it. If you're closing multiple tags, close them in the reverse order when they were opened. Tags in XHTML are always in lowercase. Attribute names are always in lowercase. If you see somebody using uppercase tags or uppercase attribute names, they're probably using earlier versions of HTML. Is it the case that in other versions of HTML, it's optional or required to use uppercase tags? Yes, but again, the rules can be very complex about when it's allowed and when it's optional. So my recommendation, just use lowercase. Every tag is either self-closed, as with the image tag, or else it's closed after the end of its content occurs. Don't leave stuff open. Running your stuff through the W3C's validator, there's a link to it on the workshop website, will help you catch these kinds of errors. And again, the problem with making these kinds of errors is that you're making browsers guess what you really meant. Different browsers will guess in different ways. Perhaps most importantly, your HTML code should be readable by you, right? Do whatever you need to do. Add extra spaces at the beginning of stuff. Put new stuff on new lines when you need to. Add the extra few bytes here and there so that when you're looking at the code in 6 months and you want to make a change, you don't have to sort out what your mental process was when you wrote it the first time. So just to take a look at, I don't know, some random document on my website. You'll notice that I use a lot of indenting, and my practice is the more tags that are enclosing something, the farther I indent. This makes it easy for me to tell later on just what's going on, right? If I want to find out where, and again, using a good text editor will help me trace where a tag begins and ends. Notice that if I click at the beginning of one of these LI tags, it'll highlight the ending one. That's really helpful. Another thing I like about Bluefish is if I hit return, it indents as much as the initial line did that was above it. Again, really helpful so that I can maintain a consistent kind of development, consistent kind of appearance for my code. No, I don't want to change that or save that. Questions?
A random question.
Go.
Is there a link to nearly free speech through your website? Just make sure that, if I Googled it, it could give me something that gives me a virus, which is nothing before.
Oh, no there isn't, but there probably should be. That's a good idea. But really it is just nearlyfreespeech.net.
I did it and it didn't give me a virus.
Okay. And I want to right, nearlyfreespeech.net. Yeah. So use as many pieces of white space as you need to use to make yourself engage in good coding practices. Remember that your overarching concern should be that writing your HTML should describe the structure of your text and not its appearance. Using HTML is not the same as using a word processor. Worry about presentation later, content first. Just as a sort of a closing thing, it's worth pointing out that there are topics I haven't talked about today, but that I want to introduce you to briefly. First off, there is no tag, right? I'm using tag here just to mean any tag. Could be P, could be A, could be div or span, which we'll talk about in a second. Could be H1. There are some attributes that you can apply to any tag. You can give any tag an ID. And again, this is one way to create an anchor point to that tag. When you give it an ID, it has to be letters and numbers only, and it has to be unique across the entire document. You cannot assign the same ID twice. You'll notice that I'm saying for some purpose of your own in many of these places. I'm being intentionally vague here because there are several major reasons that might constitute a purpose of your own. We'll talk about some, well, actually we'll spend a substantial amount of time talking about what I mean by for some purpose of your own over the next 2 workshops. You can assign something to a class. Why would you want to do that? For some purpose of your own, right? But same reason as for an ID. The short version is assigning something an ID or a class is an easy way to apply a style to it with CSS. The other version is there are widely agreed upon vocabularies that can help, that using those as values for ID or class can make your content more easily machine parsable. And we'll talk about that in spring quarter. Also, if you know some CSS and you want to start applying styles to your tags, you can just use the style attribute and put in some valid CSS styling information. This is a really bad idea to use as an overall strategy because one of the advantages of CSS is that you define an appearance in a single document. Gesundheit. You define an appearance in a single document and then apply it to all of your pages, right? And the advantage of that is, well, let's see, how many web pages do I have on my site right now? That doesn't sound right. Anyway, last I checked, I had about 300 individual HTML pages on my website, most of which I just create every quarter one at a time as notes for my students, right? Week 1 through week 10, each is an HTML file. I just type it as an HTML file because once you start learning HTML, typing it that way is much easier than trying to convert it from Microsoft Word. And actually, you get quick enough at it that you don't even notice that you're typing it anymore. So if I wanted to style my text, I shouldn't be applying styles to individual tags, because then if I wanted to change how something looked, oh my god, I'd have to go back and edit all 291 HTML files or something. So the advantage of using CSS is that you can apply a single definition to as many documents as you want, and you can then make those kind of large-scale changes. There are some tags that do nothing on their own. They're for you to play with. You can mark up a group of text for purposes of your own, using span or div, right? Span just marks up an inline section for, again, primarily for whatever reason I want. I might do this. On its own, there's no point in doing this. But the point of having this option is that I can then combine it with any of these attributes in order to do things. So I might do something like this. It's not text style, it's font style. There we go. So I've made the word book italic without indicating that it's supposed to be emphasized. Really, ideally, I want to make this emphasized, right? Because that's what the semantic meaning of what I'm doing is. But I'm just trying to provide a quick example. Similarly, you can create a block level tag with div. We'll talk about these extensively and what they're actually for over the next 2 workshops. I want to say that you can get away with writing bad HTML a lot of the time, and that I've been emphatic about wanting to encourage you to write good HTML because that helps make your meaning clear. And it really is one of those circumstances where if you decide you're going to get away with it, eventually you're going to hit the wall where you can't figure out why what you're trying to do doesn't work, and the reason is you've developed a lot of bad habits over the time that you've been writing it. So it's a good practice to write good HTML and make yourself work around whatever problems you run into. Part of the problem is that invalid HTML renders differently in different browsers. HTML that is presentational rather than semantic is a lot more effort to maintain in the long term. And if you're writing presentational, non-semantic HTML, you're going to have trouble taking advantage of the technologies that we'll be talking about in later workshops that help make you more visible to search engines like Google. So all I really want to say at this point is that it's worth getting into good habits now. So how do you know that your HTML is working before you upload it to your server? Well, again, the ideal situation is you should write good HTML in the first place. Make it intelligible to you. Make it semantic rather than presentational. Talk about structure. Don't treat it like a word processor. You want to use a text editor that does things like indents for you and has syntax highlighting, which again, super helpful when you're trying to do, when you're working with more complex documents. You should always check your formal validity through the World Wide Web Consortium's validator. The W3C's validator also has a nice feature that will clean up your code. I didn't use the fake beard picture, alas. But if you check cleanup markup with HTML tidy, what it'll do is it It takes a long time, and then it spits up a nicely cleaned out version of your code, which hopefully we'll see soon. But we'll come back to that. And you should always check it on at least 2 browsers. If you're normally a Firefox user, also check it on Google Chrome or Opera or Safari or something, just to make absolutely sure you're not accidentally depending on Firefox's particular implementation. It's a good it's good to know that different browsers don't necessarily render it pixel by pixel identical. You should also take a look on your phone and on someone else's operating system. Just in terms of how you should organize your website, don't try to put everything on one page, right? Think about if your personal website has a main page, make it a quick blurb about you and have links into other documents. Don't have all of your content on one HTML file because that makes it hard for people to find the information they're looking for. Think about different web pages if you need to as being different articles in a newspaper. Or different web pages on your site as being articles in a newspaper or magazine. Each one should be more or less complete in itself. You can use the A tag to create hyperlinks to other documents. You should always have a navigation system of some sort that links back to your main page and gives people the ability to find their way around your web page, right? At a bare minimum, at the bottom of every document, have a link that says return to home page. Why? Because not everybody knows how to hack off the ends of URLs to get back to where they were before. You do, because you're smart people. Not everyone is as technically competent as you. Use good journalistic writing practices. Remember that people don't read a web page like they read a novel. They don't start at the beginning and go through to the end. Most people skim rather than reading comprehensively on web pages. So put your important information early and put crucial information above the fold. What does that mean? As a metaphor, it's only kind of great because, of course, where the fold is depends a lot on the user's device. Organize your files in a series of folders that make sense to you and provides some kind of an epistemological indication of how the information is categorized. Remember that your folder path will become part of the URL when you upload your site. Make each subfolder increasingly specific in some sense. So what do? This is not necessarily the kind of organization that you might want to use, but I have a top level that has a bunch of various things, right? So I have a folder called TA that has my teaching assignments. It's organized by quarter. Should you organize by quarter? It's not a bad system. It may or may not work for you. So each quarter has a set of folders. Each quarter has a folder for each individual class, is I guess what I'm trying to say. In each folder, you should have an index.html file. And the reason I say that is most web servers, if you just ask for a URL that doesn't have a file name at the end, what it'll serve is a file called index.html. So have that there so that they don't get some ugly listing like, well, the tidy function isn't working today. But if you think about it, you don't want your users to get this, right? That would be ugly, and it's confusing. And if you have an index.html file in your folder, then the server will serve that instead of a listing of the folder contents. What else? This is what I want to leave us with. We should have, I would like to schedule a follow-up working workshop, more working-oriented workshop in about a week. And what I'd like to have people, depending on what works for other people, and what I'd like to have people do in the meantime is take a document, say your section guidelines handout for your current section that you're teaching, or some other document that's not currently an HTML document, and turn it into an HTML document using the stuff that you've learned today. So take your section guidelines handout, do your best, and come back in a week. And I'll give you help at that time with whatever problems you have. Start setting up a section website if you have some extra time. Include a home page and then maybe copies of whatever policy documents you have time to convert over. Produce HTML versions of any other documents. Run them through the W3C's validator and come back. If you have signed up for a web host, I'll help you upload your stuff. And come talk to me in my office hours if you have trouble. What I would like to say as far as converting a section guidelines, converting a document to HTML goes, is that most word processors will give you an option to save as HTML. Don't do it. Like, really just don't. Like, Microsoft Word writes horrible HTML, and the reason for that is they're trying to avoid complaints from users who say, I saved this as HTML, and then I opened it back up in Word, and it doesn't look exactly the same. But I want you to think about your documents not in terms of it should look exactly like it looks in Word, but you should be writing semantically meaningful markup. So what I would suggest that you do, where have my documents gone? Of course, my course syllabus already is an HTML file because that's how I wrote it. But imagine that you have a Word document. What I'd like to have you do is just select all, copy it, and paste it in as a plain text file into a new plain text file. Save that somewhere in a good folder that you can keep track of. And just call it syllabus.html. And then go through and add the markup that you need to add. Here's my heading. And then put, here's a subheading. Put P tags around your paragraphs. Again, this is not actually all that much trouble, but you will encounter some rough spots where you're not sure how to mark those up. Come talk to me about that. Does this seem like a fair kind of a thing to have people do? Again, I'm not grading you. You don't have to do it. I'm not going to make you. I can't assign you a grade in any sense. But this is this is an exercise that you might go through in about an hour. And if you can't do it in one sitting, well, do it in 6 sittings. Break off 10 minutes here and there and work through the skills that we've been talking about today, because you haven't actually learned anything if you're not practicing this. So
You don't exactly have to go ahead and open up a website with, say, nearly free speech, do you?
no, but if you come back and you've signed up for, say, nearlyfreespeech.net, I signed up with them with $5 in credit almost 2 years ago, and I'm still working. They took 63 cents in credit card processing fees right away, because that's about how much it costs to process a $5 credit card payment, as it turns out. And I'm still working through the remaining $4.37 in credit. So if you want to put $5 on nearlyfreespeech.net or any other web host of your choice, then I'll help you upload stuff, and I'll show you how to do so. If you just want to play with the HTML documents and come back in a week, then I'm happy to look at them and give you suggestions.
Okay. I was just wondering, if we did sign up for nearly free speech or something, would we have to have, the HTML documents ready to be uploaded?
No. If you don't, you can sign up, and it won't cost you anything until you put something on there and start storing stuff. Should we talk about scheduling before you take off?
So you mean not next week, but the week right after, right? Because next week.
Oh yeah, next week is in fact Thanksgiving. So yeah.
I'd be open for that, like marking up a document or something
Yeah.
like that.
Start with something like this, and maybe we should meet in 2 weeks would be a better idea. Unless people want to meet early. Early next week is kind of bad for me.
Yeah, it wouldn't work for me.
Yeah.
This week.
Okay. Yeah, because people are leaving town. So, what are generally good times for people? Is there a consensus? My own preference is late in the week, as much as possible.
Sometimes. I'm pretty flexible.
Okay.
Pretty flexible, so if people want to suggest times, odds are,
Are there times that aren't good for you on, say, Thursday and Friday?
Fridays sometimes get a bit backed up. actually, no, just Fridays in general aren't the best. Thursdays are okay as long as it's before like 3:30. Because if I'm working at the IHC, then I have stuff. But
Okay.
other than that,
Anybody want to add anything to this list?
Impossible for me would be 12:30 to 1:45 on Thursday, if we're just dealing with Thursday.
Okay.
But Friday's fine.
Okay.
For me, Thursday at 3 is good.
Thursday at 3 is good.
Same today.
I gotta run, Patrick.
Okay.
But
And
like I
Lizzie?
said, I'm flexible. I try to work with what people need.
Thursdays are pretty open for me,
Okay.
so.
Thursdays are good.
I think so.
Of course. Was that helpful for everybody? Okay. Again, come talk to me if you have trouble.
Okay.
Email me, absolutely. Give me your email address.
Yes, I think that I'm gonna email you.
Okay.
Because I am not TA in the writing program, so
Okay.
I am here just because I was a student of Karen Lansford, so she sent me the
Oh, yeah.
information.
You're absolutely welcome.
But I like it, I like to practice, so I think that actually have one question because I was late. So you talk about the editor that we are gonna use, or?
Yeah, I use one called Bluefish, but you can use any plain text
Oh, okay.
editor at all.
Okay.
Even just Windows Notepad will work fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And also, the idea is to prepare our classes, or I would like to work, for example, with my CV and some of my.
Yeah, absolutely do whatever it is that's
Oh,
helpful
okay,
for
okay,
you.
okay.
Good night. Yeah. I'm just trying to use, preparing a course website.